Dr. Ralph Merkle graduated from Livermore High School. See, I went back.
Cool.
And proceeded to study computer science at the University of California, Berkeley, obtaining his BA in '74 and his MS in 1977. In 1979, he received his PhD in electrical engineering at Stanford University with a thesis entitled Secrecy, Authentication, and Public Key Systems. His advisor was Martin Hellman. While at Stanford, he co-invented public key cryptography. Dr. Merkle joined Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in 1988, where he pursued research in computational nanotechnology until 1999. He was a principal fellow at Zyvex, and now a senior research fellow at the Institute for Molecular Manufacturing. He chaired the 4th and 5th Foresight Conferences on Nanotechnology, was co-recipient of the 1998 Feynman Prize for Nanotechnology for Theory, and was co-recipient of the Association for Computing Machinery's, we didn't go over the pronunciation of this,
Cryonics, yep. Cryonics.
Award for Theory and Practice, the 2000 RSA Award in Mathematics, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers Kobayashi Award for the revolutionary invention of public key crypto systems, which formed the foundation for privacy, integrity, and authentication in modern communication systems. And that's just a fraction of what was available on Wikipedia. The title of today's presentation is Science, Long Life, and Cryonics. Please help me welcome Dr. Ralph Merkle.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And let me see if I can fire up the slideshow here. Ooh, there we go. Science, Long Life, and Cryonics. So before I start off, I'd like to point out that there's a URL at the bottom. It's my domain name, merkle.com/talks. And if you go to that domain name, you'll find a list of talks in chronological order. And the most recent one, chronologically, is this one. And you'll find a link to the PowerPoint slides. So don't worry if you see any lists or links or in the talk or any references or anything like that. You don't have to frantically write them down. You can go off to the URL and you'll find them there. So just relax, enjoy, watch the nice talk. If there's anything you say, oh, that'd be nice for me to look up later, you can look it up later. So with that, we'll start off. And the first thing I'd like to say is if any of you want a nice introduction to cryonics, there's a very nice article written on the subject by a guy named Tim Urban. And he specializes, his blog specializes in writing informative summaries of subjects that he thinks would be interesting. That's what he does in his blog. And he goes out, finds subjects that he thinks would be interesting, and does in-depth research on them, and describes them from the perspective of someone coming to the subject for the first time. And he does a very good job of this. So if you want to have a description of cryonics from the point of view of someone who's coming to it for the first time, and you want a good, accurate description of the subject, I can recommend this article, Why Cryonics Makes Sense, by Tim Urban on Wait But Why, his article. So, okay, a quick summary of what you're going to be hearing. First off, I'm going to talk about arranging atoms. So that's science and technology stuff. Then I'm going to talk about the revolution in medicine that arranging atoms enables. Then I'm going to talk about how that revolution in medicine will let us make cryopreservation, how it makes cryopreservation a sensible option. Then we'll talk about what's involved in cryopreservation, what's involved in waking up from cryopreservation. And then we'll talk about the organizational issues involved in cryopreservation. So with all of that as introduction, now we get into the meat, the hardcore technical issues about what is it we're saying today. And with that, I will now discuss coal. That's a picture of coal. Coal is made from carbon atoms. Lots and lots of carbon atoms. That's a diamond. A diamond is made from carbon atoms. Same carbon atoms. Different arrangement of carbon atoms. Coal and diamonds, same atoms, different arrangement. It makes a big difference how atoms are arranged. This is sand. This is technical stuff, by the way. This is sand. Sand is made of silicon and oxygen and impurities. This is a computer chip. It's made of silicon and oxygen and impurities. Again, same atoms, different arrangement. How atoms are arranged is very important. This is a person. Not very healthy. They're in a hospital. This is also a person. This is a healthy person. Again, same atoms, different arrangement. How atoms are arranged makes an immense difference to us in terms of our health, in terms of our wealth, in terms of everything we care about. Well, back in 1959, a very famous physicist, Richard Feynman, gave a talk. And in his talk, he asked the question, what would happen if we could arrange the atoms one by one the way we want them? That would be a pretty amazing technology. We could change coal into diamonds. We could change sand into computer chips. We could make unhealthy people healthy. That would be something. So that raises a question. How do we arrange atoms? Well, it's easy. You do it with a scanning tunneling microscope, of course. It's a perfectly obvious answer. How many people have heard of a scanning tunneling microscope? Oh, good. Over half. Not everyone's heard of it, but a lot of people have heard of it. It was invented by Binnig and Rohr, who got the Nobel Prize in physics in 1986 for inventing the scanning tunneling microscope. And the picture you see, which looks rather ugly, is the first scanning tunneling microscope. So what is a scanning tunneling microscope? Well, it's a sharp, pointy stick, and you can see that red thing at the bottom is the sharp, pointy stick. And the sharp, pointy stick is moved over a surface, and the blue rectangular thing is the surface. And if you have a really sharp, pointy stick, then the atom at the end of the sharp, pointy stick, and as you can see in the circular blow-up, the end of the sharp, pointy stick has an atom sticking out at the end of it. The atom at the end of the sharp, pointy stick almost touches the atoms on the surface of the thing you're scanning. And if you put a voltage across the tip and the surface, so you apply a little voltage, then you get a little current flowing from the tip to the surface. And as you pull the tip away from the surface, the voltage, or rather the current flow, stops. And as you approach the surface, the current flow starts up again. So you've got a way of telling whether you're touching the surface or not. And then you can scan the tip across the surface, and you can tell where the bumps in the surface are. You can feel the surface by telling where the current flow stops and starts. And you can scan the surface and build up a picture, and these are the pictures you can get. These are pictures that were taken with scanning probe microscopes or scanning tunneling microscopes. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, you see the letters IBM spelled out in xenon atoms. All right, how many people have seen that picture before? Okay, fewer, but you've still got several people who've seen it. That's not only can you see atoms with a scanning tunneling microscope, but you've got a sharp, pointy tip, and you've got atoms on a surface. You can dip the tip down, and you can push on the atoms, and you can push them around. And some researchers at IBM pushed atoms around on a surface. And they pushed the atoms around into the letters IBM. You'll never guess who they worked for. And you can also push atoms into other shapes. You can push them into circles. You can push them into other characters. And in fact, in the lower right, you'll see some atoms pushed into the letters NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So guess who they worked for? So a lot of researchers have been doing this. They've been building basically sort of nano advertising for their companies. And they've been demonstrating that you can arrange atoms, at least in 2 dimensions on a surface. So this is opening up a whole new world, and it's been doing something rather amazing. It's been showing that you can touch and move individual atoms, and it's been opening up something that traditionally has been done at a larger scale. Traditionally, we have hands, and the way we build things is we hold parts, and we position parts, and we assemble parts, and that's how we build things. That's how our factories work. That's how we started out. I mean, originally when we were back in the caves, we'd take rocks and bang them together and make things using that early technology. And we've advanced since then, but we've never been able to do that with atoms. And now we can, which is quite remarkable. And back in 1959, Feynman, remember Feynman? We were talking about Feynman. Feynman said, I want to build 1 billion tiny factories, which are manufacturing, drilling holes, stamping parts. He wants to build little tiny things. And now that we have a technology that can move and arrange molecular parts, we know we can do it. We're on the edge of this new amazing ability. We should be able to apply at the molecular level the lessons we've learned at the scale of you and me about how to build things, which leads to the concept of a nanofactory. And on the next slide, I'll show you our best current guess about what a nanofactory So that's coming somewhere down the pike. We're going to have that in our future. And it will build, pretty much what we want. Now, what's the impact of these things going to be? The impact of a new manufacturing technology depends on what you make. Well, what are we going to make? Well, we could make a lot of things. And some of the time I talk about lots of things that we're going to make. I'm only going to talk about two things. And I'm only going to talk about the nanocomputers a little teeny bit. And the only reason I'm going to talk about the nanocomputers at all is because you need to have some form of computation to run the thing I'm mostly going to talk about, which is medical nanorobots. Medical nanorobots are what you need if you're going to have advanced medicine. Okay, so let's have one or two slides on computing. Guess what? We're going to have really powerful computers in the future. Moore's law is going to keep right on going for another few decades. If you've heard doom and gloom about, Moore's law is coming to an end, no, it's not. We might have to switch technologies, but Moore's law is going to keep right on going. And the reason I know this is that we've analyzed a particular type of molecular computer which has a lot more computing power than anything that's been proposed today. And it's got, well, you can look at it, but what it boils down to is it's got something like 11 or 12 orders of magnitude. That's roughly 1 trillion times more computer power per unit per watt. It's got about 1 trillion times more computer power per watt than computers have today. And that's a whole bunch. So I won't bore you with all the details, but suffice to say, we're going to have a lot more computer power. And then I thought I'd show you some eye candy. Isn't it pretty? It actually makes technical sense. It's a design for an atomically precise component in a molecular mechanical computer. And it's a hydrocarbon design. Little white spheres are hydrogen, and the black spheres beneath it are carbon. And it's a design for a molecular mechanical device that will operate in the near gigahertz, almost a gigahertz, a little bit slower. And it will allow you to compute using molecular mechanical operations with very little energy dissipation. And it does so with molecular rotary joints. And if you want to understand how it's working, there's a nice paper that goes into all of this stuff, and it's online, and you can read it, and it has equations and things in it. So it's all very technical and stuff. So we can build very small, very powerful computers that will let us run molecular medical nanorobots. So what's the takeaway message? We'll have a lot of computer power, and we can build molecular computers that can run very, very small devices. So that gets us to the big message, and the big message is we will have medical nanorobots. And what are medical nanorobots? Medical nanorobots are very, very small robots that are much smaller than a cell that can be programmed to run around inside your body and inside individual cells to do medically useful things, like make you healthy, which is something that all of us who are not in the pink of health would really like. Some of us who are growing older would like to remain healthy for a longer period of time. And there are various proposals for various different types of medical nanorobots. That just gives you an idea of the scale. There's a typical cell, which is about 20 microns in size. By the way, the idea of a typical cell is an oxymoron. There's no such thing as a typical cell. all cells are very specific and very individual, but to the extent there is such a thing as a typical cell, there it is. And on the left you see some typical medical nanorobots, which is even more of an oxymoron because no one has built any medical nanorobots, at least so far. So the concept of typical medical nanorobots is interesting. But nonetheless, I have a picture which shows typical cell on the right and some typical or exemplar medical nanorobots on the left. So what kind of medical nanorobots might we have? Well, first off, there's a respirocyte. What is a respirocyte? Well, people breathe, right? I'm breathing. I inhale and I exhale. And when I inhale, oxygen goes into my lungs, it's carried into my circulatory system, goes around, goes to my tissues. My tissues use the oxygen, and then they produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide goes into my circulatory system. It goes back through the circulatory into the lungs, and then I exhale, and out goes the CO2. Now, this is normally carried by my blood, and in particular, hemoglobin carries the oxygen in, and blood carries the CO2 out. And what respirocytes do is they just carry oxygen and CO2, only they do a better job of it. So a respirocyte might carry over 100 times as much oxygen as hemoglobin. And because it can carry over 100 times as much oxygen, if I have a therapeutic dose of respirocytes, if I've been injected with them so they float around in my circulatory system, I can hold my breath for over an hour. So I can inhale, all the respirocytes get oxygen in them, and then I could do something interesting, like I could sit at the bottom of a swimming pool for an hour. Not breathing, because I'd have all these respirocytes, they'd have oxygen, and they could release the oxygen into my tissues, and my tissues would be happy, and my tissues would produce CO2, and the respirocytes would soak up the CO2, and the respirocytes would sit there. Essentially, the respirocytes are very small scuba gear, scuba tanks, if you want to think of them that way. So that's nice. So there's something more useful you could do with these things. If you are prone to heart attacks, you might be injected with a therapeutic dose of these devices. And then if you actually had a heart attack and your heart stopped, normally if you have a heart attack, the sequence of events is, oh, I've had a heart attack. Thunk. And you fall over and you're unconscious. And then, if you're lucky, there are people around who grab you and haul you off and try and resuscitate you. And if you're not lucky, they don't. But if you've had a therapeutic dose of respirocytes, the sequence of events goes as follows. You have a heart attack and your heart stops. And then you say, oh, my heart has stopped. Oh my. And then you call your doctor and you say, Doc, my heart has stopped. What should I do? And your doctor says, well, you have about an hour to get down to the emergency room where we can look at you and figure out what's going on. You better get moving, because, these respirocytes only have a certain amount of oxygen and then they run out. So get moving. And then you go down to the emergency room and they start trying to figure out what's going on. And that's a very different scenario. So if you have respirocytes available, if you have respirocytes in your medical arsenal, then you can deal much more effectively with circulatory problems. So that's one example. Then we have microbivores. Just as we have artificial red blood cells, the respirocyte, we can have artificial white blood cells, the microbivore. Microbivores will basically remove pathogens from the bloodstream, and they'll do so, again, an order of magnitude or two better than white blood cells will, so they remove pathogens more effectively and more rapidly. so they can clear infections more quickly and more thoroughly. So again, that's good. And then finally we have chromalocytes, another major advance in medical nanorobots. Basically, as we grow older, our chromosomes suffer various forms of damage. And in general, we have a number of problems with chromosomes that are, well, problems, medical problems that we'd rather deal with. And chromalocytes are devices that target specific cells and remove the chromosomal material and replace the chromosomal material with a fresh set of chromosomes, which is really useful if you've got damage in the chromosomes for whatever reason. And if you have chromalocytes, you can treat a variety of ailments that are secondary to chromosomal damage. So that's something which is really nice. Let me ask a question. This kind of technology is going to be some number of decades in development. How many people would like to have this technology developed within your lifetime? Hands. Ah, okay. So that normally when people talk about time horizons, they talk about, developing technology within 2 years or 3 years. If they're really ambitious, they talk about a 5-year time horizon. The time horizon for developing these kinds of technologies, I think, can arguably be pushed out to a decade or 2 or even 3. So I think we should take a longer view in terms of developing these things. Then we have a more advanced technology, which is called a vasculoid. That's an artificial circulatory system. I won't go into this in much detail, but the idea basically is you replace the circulatory system with a container transport system. And this container transport system allows you to transport things throughout the body much more rapidly, much more efficiently, and in a way which is much more impervious to a variety of problems. It's a much more complex application, but it uses molecular machines to allow transport of a variety of circulating hormones, a variety of circulating metabolites, and to have much greater control over what it is that is circulating throughout your body. And it has a number of benefits and advantages. It's a much later stage in the development of medical nanodevices, but it is definitely something that would be advantageous. So with that as a sort of a background on sort of the general concepts, let's go to a change in medical imperatives. All of medicine is based on the concept that your tissues must repair themselves. All of today's medicine is supporting your tissue. All of today's medicine is based on the assumption that the doctor and all of our drugs and all of our surgical tools support your tissues. Because ultimately, only your tissues can repair themselves. We cannot repair the molecular machines, the biological molecular machines that exist in your tissues. We simply don't have the tools. The finest surgeon's scalpel at the scale of a cell, at the scale of the molecular machinery in the cell, at the scale of proteins, is this huge scythe more suitable to rip and tear than it is to heal and cure. So today, loss of cell function results in inevitable cellular deterioration. So the imperative in today's medicine is that function must be preserved. But we are looking at a future where we'll have medical nanorobots. And if you have medical nanorobots, non-functioning structures can be repaired or replaced. You no longer have the imperative that forces you to maintain function. Cell function can be restored provided that cell structure can be inferred. If the cell is no longer functioning, if it's no longer metabolizing, we can still restore it, we can still repair it. So you shift the medical imperative, you now have an imperative that says structure must be preserved. This has a huge impact on medicine. It changes the game completely. It changes it so dramatically that cryonics makes sense. Because we can repair tissues that are no longer functioning. So as an introduction to this whole concept and how dramatically it changes the game, I thought I would let you hear the words of a neuroscientist, David Eagleman, as he was discussing cryonics on a recent. So that's David Eagleman, and his perspective on cryonics is, hey, there's information in the brain and we can preserve it. The other perspective is there's a structure that we can restore. And perhaps you could think about cryonics this way. Cryonics, well, you're a book. And if you're a book, should we burn you or wait and see if we can read your damaged pages? And that's the perspective. More specifically, cryonics can be looked at this way. Cryonics, you enter, I think I'm losing my, let's see if I can get my microphone here back. I think I'm okay.
It's working good.
It's working good? Okay. Cryonics involves coming in at 98.6, and then you are cryopreserved. And what is cryopreservation? Cryopreservation is cooling you to the temperature of liquid nitrogen, which is minus 320 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very cold, and then keeping you at that temperature for some number of decades until we develop this advanced technology I've been talking about, and then reviving you using this advanced technology and restoring you to 98.6, and then off you walk into the new world. So that's cryonics. So the question is, what does this whole process look like when we revive you? And the answer is it looks like something that involves this very new process, this nanomedicine process. And that's basically it. That's the overview of the process. It involves what are basically stainless steel thermos bottles. So those Bigfoot dewars you saw, there's a Bigfoot dewer on the left here. That's over 10 feet tall, it's topped off weekly, and it takes over 3 months before the liquid nitrogen boils off. So you can stay in liquid nitrogen literally for thousands of years with no significant change. So let me just go through couple of basic facts. Cryobiologists are often asked how long cells can remain viable at minus 196 degrees centigrade, the temperature of boiling liquid nitrogen, which is the usual cryogenic fluid. The answer is clear: more than 1,000 years. So this is the consensus in the field of cryobiology. This is highly uncontroversial. Once you're at the temperature of liquid nitrogen, nothing changes. Getting to the temperature of liquid nitrogen involves some controversy as to terms of how much damage occurs, but once you're there, nothing changes. Now what I'd like to do is just go through some of the literature on the subject. There actually was a kidney that was cryopreserved and which was then warmed and which supported a rabbit as the sole renal support, is I believe the expression. And as a consequence, there is, how does one put it, experimental evidence that the cryopreservation of a complex mammalian organ is feasible because it's been done. So that's one of the indicators that this whole process is possible. The other thing I'd like to do is just take a look at the scientific literature in cryonics. You know, one of the things you see every once in a while is people being skeptical about cryonics. And I've always been somewhat amused by this because you get these marvelous quotes from people saying it's all nonsense, that it's not scientific. And the fact of the matter is, if you do a literature search on cryonics and you look for articles on cryonics, you find that the actual articles that address cryonics are all favorable. And I know because I've looked at the literature on cryonics. You can do it yourself if you want. You can go to PubMed, for example, and just type in cryonics and see what you get. And here's what you get when you do that. The bold-faced articles are the ones that are assessing cryonics from a technical point of view. Mine is the fourth bold article, Technical Feasibility of Cryonics. It's an article I wrote. The other three are articles other people have written which are addressing various aspects of cryonics. The pale articles, the light gray articles, are articles that are discussing cryonics but aren't technical assessments. They tend to be things like the legal aspects of cryonics or various editorials on cryonics. So if someone asks you what is the scientific perspective on cryonics as concluded by the scientific literature, the answer is the scientific perspective is that it's likely to work. This despite the fact that if you go and pick a random MD or a random cryobiologist or a random person in most fields, they will inform you that cryonics is crazy, which I find somewhat amusing. So my conclusion is that, yeah, cryonics ought to work. And if you ask people who are critical of cryonics, okay, what is it about cryonics that would make it unlikely to work? They start giving you very weird answers. Weird answers like, it shouldn't work. It's not something we should have working. People are meant to die. I always find that one interesting. A surprising number of people, when asked about cryonics, say that people should die. Then you get the line of answers that say, well, you see, if you're cryopreserved, there's no continuity of consciousness. And I always get very puzzled by that one, because technically speaking, when you're asleep, there's no continuity of consciousness. But in any event, you get interesting answers. And you don't get a technical answer that says it won't work because, and you don't get a clear technical answer that provides a clear technical reason. Okay, so getting back to the technical literature, one of the questions that crops up is, hey, if you cryopreserve someone, what happens to memory? Okay, good, solid technical question. Okay, so that's been an interesting question, and the answer is it looks like it's preserved. And the reason we think it looks like it's preserved, there are a variety of lines of argument on that. The simplest is lower animals have been cryopreserved and revived, and their memory has been preserved. So that's an article that's been published recently, The Persistence of Long-Term Memory in Vitrified and Revived C. elegans. Okay? A simple experimental result that says, yeah, the memory system in C. elegans was preserved by vitrification. You also can get indirect lines of evidence by looking at the mechanisms of long-term memory, and there's a lot of literature on the mechanism of long-term memory, and asking the question, okay, here's what we know about the mechanisms of long-term memory, here's what we know about the process of cryopreservation. Would the mechanisms of long-term memory be preserved by the process of cryopreservation? And the answer is yes. The other question you answer, by the way, one of the reasons that I think most biologists get confused about this is most biologists think that function is critical. And if you cryopreserve tissue, it becomes non-functional. And most cryobiologists will immediately say, well, it's not functional, therefore the person is dead. But if you don't think that the functional criteria is appropriate, if you think the structural criteria is appropriate, and you think that an external repair mechanism can be applied, you don't care about the functional criteria. You care about the structural criteria, at which point you say, well, yeah, who cares if the system is non-functional? If the information is there, if the memory systems are there and we can repair it, hey, we're okay. All right, MIT Technology Review, the science surrounding cryonics, they had a very nice article in which they discussed a variety of articles on the science of cryonics, and said some nice things. There was a recent article on aldehyde-stable cryopreservation, which said we have a mechanism of cryopreservation where they did not demonstrate recovery of memory functionally, but they did demonstrate beautiful pictures. In other words, there are two ways of addressing this issue of recovery of memory. One way is to revive the system and then functionally interrogate the memory system. Just to see, hey, can you remember something? The other way is to cryopreserve the system and then take pictures of the system and see if all of the things that we believe are required in the memory are there in the pictures. And if you have very nice pictures, then neuroscientists start to become happy. You start to see smiles on the faces of the neuroscientists when they look at the pictures. So there was recently a cryopreservation method that was called aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation that produces smiles on the faces of neuroscientists. And in fact, it won the Brain Preservation Prize. And there was a lot of publicity about that. In fact, there was an article in Scientific American where the headline was, "Can our minds live forever? Can a brain's connectome be preserved forever?" And this article was by Michael Shermer, which was very interesting because Michael Shermer had been quite skeptical previously, which I thought was very amusing. His attitude towards the whole process has changed dramatically over the past decade or so. So at any rate, what we've been seeing is an increase in the number of articles that are in sort of the standard scientific literature on cryonics. We've been seeing an increase in acceptance of the possibility of cryonics by sort of the standard scientific community. We've been seeing an increasingly obvious failure of critical articles. In other words, it's becoming increasingly apparent that there are no valid technical criticisms of cryonics. And by and large, things have just been moving in a very positive direction, which I find interesting. Okay, so how do we revive people? Well, a standard nanorobotic cryopreservation revival scenario involves using medical nanorobots operating at very low temperature, liquid nitrogen temperature, for example, and carrying out initial evaluation and repair at low temperature. One of the things that cryobiologists are quick to remind people of is that when you warm tissue, damage occurs. So the response is, don't do that. Carry out the repairs at low temperature, and you avoid the problems that would be caused by rewarming the tissue, and therefore you can carry out repairs at low temperature. A typical scenario would involve excavation of the circulatory system, installation of that vasculoid that I mentioned, which can operate at low temperature quite nicely, repair damage in situ, remove the infrastructure, and warm the patient. So that's a brief outline. And you complete structural analysis and repair down to the level of molecules and atoms. It's possible in principle, and in practice it will be feasible in coming decades. And I think I'll skip some of this stuff and go straight. I'm running out of time here, so to leave some time for Q&A, I'll go over to some of the financial aspects of the organization. Alcor has a patient care trust, which as of December 31st, 2015, had $10.8 million. And we had 88 whole body patients and 55 neuro patients, which is $115,508 per whole body patient equivalent, which counts each neuro patient as 1/10 of a whole body patient because they occupy 1/10 of the volume. And the draw on the PCT is very close to the 2% target. By which I mean that we got $10 million bucks, and it only costs us 2% of that $10 million bucks to care for the patients on an annual basis. So that works out pretty good. We're pretty happy with that. So that's the basic financials. And we have an organizational structure. We have a self-perpetuating board of 9 members, and the board members are longtime Alcor members. And board members expect their successors will preside over their revival sometime in the future. So, for example, I'm a board member. I am on the Alcor board. And I and my fellow board members try to make decisions that will keep the organization moving forward. And we select new board members. And we select new board members in the full knowledge that the new board members will be presiding over the organization when we are in the doer. So we are very careful about selecting new board members because we want them to keep the organization on track when we are no longer able to do so ourselves. So that's one of the basic functions of board members. So, the basic question after all of this is pretty simple. Yeah, I see people are reading the question. Yeah, look, in a very literal sense, cryonics is an experiment. And we're going to get a reliable answer to the question of whether cryonics works sometime in the future. You know, come back in 100 years, and we'll give you a reliable answer. Because the correct experiment, I mean, if you really want to get an experimentally correct answer, scientifically proper and all that, does cryonics work? Well, you conduct an experiment. You select N subjects, You cryopreserve them, you wait until the future technology is developed, and then you see if the technology of 2100 can revive the cryopreserved patients. I mean, that's the correct experiment to conduct, to see if we can revive cryopreserved patients. Now, there's a slight problem with that experiment, and the problem is we cannot get the results of that experiment until 2100. So the choice that you get to make is whether or not you want to join the control group or the experimental group. Now, I will tell you that the outcome for the control group is known with a high degree of confidence. The outcome with the experimental group, well, I have a number of arguments that say that the outcome with the experimental group is likely to be favorable, and I've presented those arguments. But we don't have the outcome for the experimental group yet, and you get to make a decision as to whether you want to join the experimental group or the control group based on our current state of knowledge. And if you join the experimental group and it works, then you get to wake up in the future. And you get to see the advanced technology that we're talking about and the advanced medical technology. And I can guarantee that if you wake up in the future, there will be advanced medical technology. Because if we do not have advanced medical technology, you will not wake up. So there will be advanced medical technology if you wake up. And you will have a long and healthy life, because there will be advanced medical technology. So that's the story, that's cryonics, and that's the choice that you get to make today. And by definition, you do not get the results of the experiment, so you do not have the experimental outcome with which to make the choice. You must use other data to make that choice. There is other data available, but you don't get the results of the experiment. You get to participate in the experiment. That's what cryonics is all about.
All right, so let's...
And with that...
Thanks for the talk. Since I hold the microphone, I'd like to ask one first question, very brief. What kind of animal is C. elegans in the...
C. elegans is a nematode. It's a little small thing. It's small enough so you can actually cryopreserve it and revive it, and it's functional, so you can test its memory.
Okay.
So basically, one of the requirements, if you're going to do a functional test of memory, is you got to be able to revive the organism in order to test the memory.
Sure.
So that's one of the requirements.
All right. Any questions? Let's start over here.
Yeah, so do you freeze people like right after death, or can you take somebody who's near death, and wouldn't it be better to go ahead and sort of execute them in a very way that is cryogenically compatible?
Okay,
and what
so
does it cost, to have that done, and how much is it per year to maintain it? Do you pay for it yourself, and how does that work?
Okay, so what's it cost? And the answer is typically it's paid for with life insurance. The cost is $80,000 for neuro, which basically is you freeze the brain, and the brain comes in this nice package called your skull, which provides protection. So we take the whole head. That's $80,000 for insurance. Or you can have the whole body, and that's $200,000. And then there's annual sort of fees. And like I say, typically it's done with life insurance, but if you're not able to get life insurance, other arrangements can be made, trusts or whatever. And as for the legality, we have been operating under a very simple rule. Cryopreservation takes place following legal death. Now, as you are probably aware, the law and reality go their separate ways on many occasions, and this is one of them. When you are declared legally dead, this can occur at a point when you can, in fact, be revived. This is the purpose of DNR orders, do not resuscitate orders. So if you are dying and you have requested a DNR order, then at the point in time when your heart stops, then you can be declared legally dead and the cryopreservation process can begin, even if you could be revived. So the most favorable circumstance for cryopreservation is you are dying, you know you're dying, you have advance warning, you go to a hospice near Alcor, a friendly hospice near Alcor, and Alcor is able to initiate the cryopreservation protocol on declaration of death, which occurs with cessation of heartbeat, and the process rolls forward. And I won't go into the unfavorable scenarios because they range. And then one gets into this whole debate about how long can one go before it's just not going to work. And this gets into a whole set of discussions about at what point is the memory in the brain lost. Mostly people think or believe that the brain is dead 6 minutes after the circulation stops. This is clearly false because there has been experimental work where cats, for example, have been revived after an hour of cessation of circulation. And furthermore, once you shift from the functional criteria to the structural criteria, the requirement that you revive the tissue simply becomes irrelevant. And you start to ask questions like, when is it that the memory subsystems have become so damaged that the memory structures themselves lose coherence? And there's a lot of discussion about this, but this seems to be preserved for several hours before there would be a substantial risk of loss of the memory subsystems. But suffice to say, there's a lot of debate on that subject.
Two questions.
Yes.
One is, you mentioned neurobody versus whole body freeze, which
Yes.
brings up the question of, if I understood you correctly, in neurobody you only freeze the brain.
Yes.
So what good is a frozen brain if the rest of the body deteriorates?
You replace it. In other words, right now, medical technology is already talking about replacing a liver or a heart or an arm or a leg. And if you simply continue with that trend in existing medical technology, you rapidly reach a point where replacement of everything will be feasible. The one organ that we cannot replace is the brain, for obvious reasons. So there's really no reason to keep, this thing if we can
Skin,
replace
everything,
it.
not just organs, but skin, flesh, everything. I mean,
Toss it. Yeah. I'm signed up neuro.
and then
for
my other
example.
question is, when you mentioned the memory question, I was hoping that you would also mention the follow-up question in my mind, which is, decades later, when you come back, life is not as you knew it. Everything is going to be completely different. most importantly, the people you knew. So unless the people you knew are also frozen along with you, and then all the changes in the world, it's kind of like, I've heard that when people are in coma, which is only a few weeks, not decades, when they wake up, they have complete confusion, like they don't know where they are, what they're doing. So what about that aspect of it?
Okay, so
Thank you.
One of the big reasons that people say, yeah, I believe it'll work, I don't want to do it. And in fact, this is surprisingly common. And the core arguments go as follows. Look, if I'm cryopreserved, I'm going to wake up in a world where I'm useless, I have no skills, I don't know the people, my friends are all dead, my family is all dead. Why should I do this? I mean, life is bad enough as it is. And the response is fairly simple. There are a couple responses. The simplest is, hey, sign up your friends. That's the first one. For example, my wife is signed up, and I have friends in the cryonics community. I have a lot of friends in the cryonics community. So I expect to wake up and, hey, I'll have a bunch of friends in the cryonics community. The other answer is that it's not going to be that bad, I mean, a lot of the people who are involved in cryonics basically think that being alive is better than being dead because being alive is worth it. Even if you wind up traveling to this new country called the future, it's better than not being alive, than not having that as an opportunity. In other words, how do I put it? If you are traveling to a new country, it's sort of like, hey, do you want to go to another country? Do you want to go from Europe to America? Is that worth it? Is it worth it to become a pioneer in a new country? That's part of the attitude. And also part of the attitude is just, it's not going to be that long. In other words, one of the things going on is people think, oh, it's going to be centuries before people are awakened. And I don't think it's going to be that long. If you look at the rate at which technology is advancing, it's advancing fast enough that we're looking at a few decades, not a few centuries. And in the period of a few decades, all of your younger friends are going to be there, first off. I can go on, but at any rate, if you look on the Alcor website, you'll find a FAQ which addresses this quite directly. But the answer is, yeah, a lot of people are worried about that. They don't want to wake up in a future where they don't have anything. Oh, yes, and the other thing is there's also the Alcor Model Trust. So you can take your money, put it in the Alcor Model Trust, and wake up with a pot of money, and the miracle of compound interest will make you wealthy. So look, seriously, there are people who have told me they don't want to be cryopreserved unless they can keep their money. They'd rather wake up, they'd rather die than wake up poor. And that was the key thing. That was it. That was their concern.
Go ahead and ask your question. We're running out of time.
Yeah, two questions. The first is, what happens, supposedly, that Alcor get bankrupt? What will happen with all these bodies that are now waiting to be resuscitated?
Okay, so the risk, so basically financial stability. Okay, there are a couple of answers. First, Alcor has been around since 1972, and we've managed to live this long. Secondly, we take that very seriously. As I say, we've got a self-perpetuating board to provide organizational stability. Also, the Patient Care Trust is established as a separate trust, and it has funds in it which are purely for the maintenance of the patients. So that money that I mentioned is not all of Alcor's assets. That's just assets for maintenance of the patients, and that's a separate pot of money which is purely dedicated to keeping the patients cryopreserved, and that trust is a separate organization with its own board, and that trust, if anything happens to the rest of Alcor, that trust can be broken off as a separate organization and go on by itself. So the answer is, yeah, we worry about that. And we do the best we can to make sure that no matter what happens, the patients will be revived. If you look at the Alcor mission statement, the first item on the mission statement is keep the patients who are cryopreserved in cryopreservation.
Okay, my second question is, instead of this very complex process to repair a whole body, because the body will have a lot of things to repair, could we not preserve the DNA, a complete genome, and then make it work in the future?
That's what you want. You don't need Alcor.
Yeah, the problem is, of course, this person will be born again and will have to relearn, will have no more memory probably, but that was my question.
The answer is, yeah, if you want to do that, you don't need Alcor. It's a lot cheaper to take a DNA sample and just, put it in an envelope or wherever, and just wait for the technology to advance to the point where that DNA could be used to.
Can you create free?
Well, we're running out of time.
We don't do that.
And thanks for a great talk. And we'll you can sit at the speakers table in the back, and people can ask
Anyone
questions.
wants to ask questions? I'll be around.